So I preach in a series. I like preaching a series. And this is the third of three. And the last two sermons have tried to address some fairly heavy topics. First, if you weren't here, first we looked at the external forces that are consuming our collective future in exchange for rewards for some today. And something that I and other people across history have referred to as Moloch, the biblical prohibition of child sacrifice in exchange for abundance. It's the story of a people who are willing to sacrifice the future for the treasure today. And Moloch has been collecting tribute for thousands of years. But right now we're really. And it would be easy for us to point the finger at the devouring billionaires like Jeff Bezos, denouncing them as Moloch. But it's more complicated than that, because every time that we make a purchase on Amazon, we're also selling our collective future to buying a product made in China for the convenience of having it delivered to our door within 24 hours. Moloch is a complicated system of bad choices. And then last week we looked at the internal forces of spiritual resignation and ennui that numbs our capacity to feel and turns us into frenetic creatures, sort of buzzing with activity, overbooked lives, in an effort to avoid looking inward and confronting what might feel like a great expanse of meaninglessness. And this term for this is acedia. It's an idea that comes to us from the early desert Christian hermits. And it simply just means not caring or lack of caring. And the power of these two forces, the external and the internal, have ebbed and flowed over time, but in this moment they are particularly high. So high, in fact, that unless we find a way to combat them, they could bring an end to humanity. Climate change is not actually the problem. Our willingness to consume as if our resources are limitless and our disbelief that anything can be done to change that behavior is the problem. It's what's causing climate change. This is a human problem. And a handful of you spoke to me after these sermons to share how depressing the messages were. And one of you even joked, "Great sermon. Now I'm going to go home and kill myself." And I laughed because I appreciated it. I often use gallows humor myself. It's one of the ways that I manage overwhelming feelings. But if you felt bad, good. Yeah, you felt bad, good. In a culture that is driving us, that is full of distraction and delusion, that's driving us to avoid our feelings, it's good to feel bad, because what we're living through is not okay. It's not okay. And I actually believe the world is trying to wake us up from our spiritual slumber by trying to break our hearts. And we've been running from heartbreak as fast as we can. But maybe we shouldn't. And maybe you don't think of it that way. Maybe you call it staying informed or being realistic or managing stress. But your body knows the truth. The tightness in your chest isn't just anxiety. And the exhaustion that we all seem to be living with isn't just from being busy. It's grief. Unacknowledged, unwitnessed, unshed grief. And it's everywhere. But we keep our heads down trying to pretend like there isn't a monster in the room. But there is. And our challenge is to discern how to address it together, not as individuals, but as a community. Today we welcomed 4 new members into our church. Beautiful. I love New Member Sunday. And they shared a little bit of their story, and they signed the book, and they heard us say, welcome. You have a home with us. People will hold your hand here. You don't have to do this alone anymore. But here's what those 4 people are about to discover. Becoming a member isn't about finding sanctuary from the outside world, nor do we gather to feel better. We gather to feel more. the world is a lot to deal with, and it can shut us down emotionally, physically, spiritually. And when we're shut down, we make bad choices, expedient choices that aren't always good for us in the long term. And I don't condemn this. It makes sense. The world is a lot for an individual. But as a community, we can absorb more. So we don't gather to feel good. We gather to feel more. And right now, in this moment in history, feeling more means feeling grief. Your heart knows what we're living through is wrong. You read the news and something in you recoils. You scroll on Instagram and you can't stop, but it's depressing. You see people living on the sidewalks and something breaks. You think about your grandchildren's future and something cracks open. That's grief. That's your heart breaking, as it should. In the quiet moments, when we give ourselves a bit of an opportunity to look, we can see what we're losing. We can see the future that's being stolen, the lives that are being destroyed, and it matters. It matters so much that it breaks us. But grief is terrifying, so we run and we stay busy and we stay numb and we stay functional. And some people try to deal with this by turning to the gratitude route. Look on the bright side, count your blessings, focus on what you can control. It's not as bad as the US. And gratitude matters. But when we use it to bypass grief, when we weaponize thankfulness against our own heartbreak, it becomes another form of numbing, another way to run. It's what happens when we try to think our way around grief rather than letting ourselves feel through it. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I welcome to be as honest as you're willing. But if you're feeling overwhelmed by all of this, all of what's out there, all of what's maybe in your life that nobody knows about, will you raise your hand? You're feeling overwhelmed by the climate collapsing, by democracy eroding, by cruelty, by the chaos, by the future being stolen. Raise your hands. The grief feels like too much. Just look around. Oh, keep your hand raised. Come on, we got to do this. We got to show these. Look around. Almost every single one of you, nearly every hand in this room. When we drop our intellectual guard, when we stop pretending like we're fine, when we stop staying busy, when we stop thinking our way around, all of us here, we're all feeling this. You're not alone in your overwhelm. You're not weak for feeling crushed by the weight of the moment. This is an appropriate response to what's happening. Your grief is sane. Your dread is rational. Joanna Macy, the Buddhist teacher and activist, does not dismiss gratitude. In fact, her process for addressing the ecological despair begins with gratitude. But then it moves into the second stage. The second movement of her process is called honoring our pain in the world. Both together, not one or the other. Gratitude grounds us in what is still beautiful, what is worth fighting for, but grief honors what's being lost, what's already gone. And you can't skip the grief and arrive at hope. You can't bypass heartbreak and still love deeply. The question isn't gratitude versus grief. It's whether we're brave enough for both. And this is one of the reasons I love fiction. I think a lot of us love fiction for this reason. Good authors and good directors are able to bring us to a cathartic moment in the movie or the book where we can feel the gratitude and the grief coming together at the same time. Who remembers the Dead Poets Society? Yeah. The boys stand on their desk, honoring the teacher who has been fired, the teacher who helped them feel something, perhaps for the first time. Do you remember what they said? Oh, Captain, my Captain. Some of us, when was that movie? That was 30 years ago? That line still sticks with us because of that moment, what that movie did for us. It was a salute to grief and gratitude. Maybe you didn't see that movie, but maybe you remember the Who's from Whoville, right? And the Grinch steals everything, all the presents and the decorations and the feasts and the ornaments, every material thing that made Christmas Christmas. And they wake up Christmas morning and they find it all gone, and what do? They gather in a circle and they hold hands and they sing. Not because they're in denial, not because stuff doesn't matter, but because their joy, their connection, their love for each other, that can't be stolen. That survives the theft. Grief and joy held together, loss acknowledged, love proclaimed, both true at once. Do you remember that moment in the Hunger Games where Katniss and Peeta are about to be taken as tribute, a literal reenactment of the future of a town stolen as sacrifice to Moloch? And the crowd raises their 3 fingers, a salute to the grief and the gratitude. So gratitude is one way. But maybe you've tried to deal with this sense of overwhelm with anger instead, rage at the injustice of it all, fury at the systems, the politicians, the billionaires who are destroying everything. I'm angry enough. If I'm angry enough, I won't have to feel sad. This rage is really powerful. God, I cannot tell you how strong I feel when I am really upset. It's energizing. In that moment, it feels better than the helplessness of grief. But anger that bypasses heartbreak becomes something toxic. It becomes brittle and performative. We burn out, or we turn cruel. We lash out at our allies, devour our own. The left is fantastic at this. Because we're using our anger to run from the grief, and the grief always catches up. And Walter Brueggemann teaches that prophetic ministry has 3 essential movements: naming reality, public lament, and energizing hope. And you cannot skip the middle step. Anger that bypasses grief isn't prophetic, it's just rage. It burns hot and fast and leaves nothing but ash. But lament is what transforms anger into something that lasts, into fierce love, into energy that sustains us through decades of resistance, not just weeks. Right? The prophets didn't just rage, they wept. They tore their clothes, they sat in ashes, they let their hearts break publicly. And this is what made them dangerous. When Colin Kaepernick knelt during the American anthem to protest the murder of black people by the police, the outrage was immediate. Why can't he just be grateful? He's rich and famous and successful. Look at him disrespecting the flag. But Kaepernick's body knew what his mind couldn't ignore. Black people were being killed, are being killed. His kneeling was lament, public grief, a refusal to celebrate while his community mourned. And he lost his career over expressing his grief. But he helped spark a movement. Because lament, witnessed, embodied, sustained, is more powerful than rage, more dangerous, harder to dismiss. Or maybe you threw yourself into work, organizing, protesting, volunteering, meetings, petitions, phone banks. If I can fix it, I won't stop to feel, I'll just act. And action matters. God knows we need it. But when we use busyness to outrun heartbreak, the work becomes grim duty instead of love. We get exhausted and cynical. The fight feels hopeless because we've disconnected from what we're fighting for. We aren't acting from love. We're running from grief, and grief always catches up. Joanna Macy distinguishes action rooted in guilt or fear, which burns out, from action rooted in love. Love for what is, love for what could be, love for this beautiful, mutilated world that is so precious. But you can't access that love without grieving what's being lost. The grief is the love. They are the same thing. You only grieve what you cherish, and the depth of your grief is the measure of the depth of your love. So when we numb ourselves to grief, when we run from heartbreak, we are also running from love. Your capacity to love can never be greater than your willingness to be heartbroken. Never. Well, last week I mentioned the desert Ama, Syncletica. And she taught her community that weeping is resistance to acedia, resistance to the numbing, not sentimentality, not self-pity, but that keening, that wailing, that letting the grief move through your body like a storm, which can feel a little much for those of us who like to be in control. But acedia, the spiritual malady of not caring, thrives when we stay numb, when we keep everything locked in our heads, disconnected from our bodies, disconnected from our hearts. But grief keeps you alive, Syncletica says. It's dangerous. It awakens. The Desert Mothers knew that if you want to care deeply, you must grieve deeply. There's no other way through. Grief is a spiritual discipline. Grief is resistance. Yesterday, you were like me. You followed what was going on in the States, these No King rallies. Millions of people showed up to embody their grief at what is happening in their country. There was even a rally held not too far from here, Place du Canada. This rally was called No Tyrants because, Canada still has a king, which is kind of weird. And the primary audience for the one here in Montreal was American expats and their Canadian families and friends who are grieving from afar. But Canada has its own grief to deal with, Having a neoliberal banker prime minister is not actually the solution. But that is a way, and we say that, right? At least we're not America. At least it isn't Poliev. And I worry that that's a way of avoiding our grief. Neoliberal bankers are not the answer. Still, I loved seeing all of these photos coming up on my feed, city after city, creative prophetic signs held by people choosing to grieve together and laughing, right? Witnessing each other's suffering, but refusing and rejecting the cruelty. In this shared grief, we all find something the regime can't touch. When we grieve together, we discover that we're not alone, and we become immovable. Brené Brown spent years researching people who described themselves as wholehearted. That was her term, wholehearted. And it was for people who felt deep belonging, deep purpose, deep joy. And what she came to realize what they all had in common, it wasn't that they avoided pain. It wasn't that they just stayed positive. It was that they believed that their vulnerability made them beautiful. They'd given up trying to protect themselves from heartbreak. And Brown's conclusion is devastating and liberating. right? Our capacity to feel love can never be greater than our willingness to be heartbroken. The ceiling of your love is set by your willingness to grieve. So as a community, here's our choice. As a church, here's our choice. You can keep running using positivity or anger or busyness or at least it's better than projection, right? To stay defended, never letting the grief touch us, stay functional, stay strong. And that's not cowardice. That's a form of wisdom earned through pain. However, the other choice is we can stop running. We can let our hearts break for this world. We can risk being undone by grief, which also means that we are risking being undone in love. That's also wisdom. Differently earned. Both choices cost something. There is no free lunch. You can't get away without paying something. But one choice leads to aliveness, to deep caring, to loving fiercely enough to sustain resistance. I know you're scared of feeling it. I'm scared too. Grief can feel like drowning, like you'll never come back up. Like if you start crying over the state of this world, you won't stop. But here's what's different about grieving together, is you won't be alone in the deep water. Carrie and I, we refer to each other as our sea otter. Our sea otter. He's my sea otter, I'm her sea otter. And that's because sea otters hold hands so they don't get washed out to sea while they're resting. Right? So in this calamitous world, she is my sea otter. I am hers. Right? The holding of hands that the sea otters do is called rafting. And that's what we offer each other here. Not a life raft that keeps you from feeling the waves, but hands that hold you so you don't drift away. Yes, it requires trust, and trust on its own is terrifying, right? What if I let you down? What if you let me down? But isolation is more terrifying. And we can build trust by practicing small acts of care again and again and again. Most trusted people in this room? The caring network. Caring. Because they show up again, again, again. And maybe in doing this practice together, we can find love, a love strong enough to grieve and a love strong enough to resist. Here's what I believe. Grief, when it's held in community, transforms. The Desert Mothers knew it. Joanna Macy used to teach it. You've seen it in every great movie or novel. Shared grief becomes fierce love. It becomes energy that sustains you when everything looks hopeless, and it becomes the capacity to care very, very deeply. Not despite the heartbreak, but because of it. And your grief won't destroy you. Your isolation will. But together, our shared heartbreak becomes power that Moloch cannot touch and that acedia cannot numb. Together, grief becomes resistance, it becomes love, it becomes life. And for me, this is one of the core elements of membership in church. When you can't stop crying about the news, someone from this room will sit with you, not to fix it, just as witness. And when you're too exhausted to keep caring, someone will say, hey, rest. I'll hold this grief for a little while for you. You held it for me last week. And this is how shared grief transforms, not into less grief, but into grief that doesn't drown you. We don't come together to feel better. We come together to feel more. It's the resistance to a world that wants us to feel less. So I'm going to raise my hand again. Some of you raised it earlier when I asked who feels overwhelmed, and this time we're going to do it a little differently. This time, you're not drowning alone, right? I'm in this deep water, and you're here with me. I'll hold your hand. You hold mine, and we won't let each other get washed away. If you're willing to stop running from the grief, if you're willing to hold and be held, raise your hand. If you're able, raise your hand. If you can't, nod, cheer your presence. Look around. These are your sea otters. Huh? These are the people who just said, I will hold your hand when grief tries to wash you away. They are not perfect. Lord knows, right? I am not perfect. Lord knows. I know. We are all brokenhearted, just like you. But they showed up, they raised their hands, they say yes to caring deeply together. You know, those of you who joined as new members today, now you know what you got into when you said yes. This is not a social club. It's not about Sunday coffee. It's a community that holds hands in the deep water of the world. When grief hits, you don't have to white knuckle it alone anymore. You reach out and you call somebody whose hand went up and you say, I need someone to hold on to. And they will. Because you held them before, or you will next week. And we build trust by practicing one held hand at a time, one witnessed tear at a time. Grief isn't going away. The climate is still collapsing. Democracy is still eroding. The future is still being stolen, right? But you're not facing it alone anymore. You're not running anymore. You're not numb anymore. You're brokenhearted and alive and anchored with each other. And that is how we resist Moloch and acedia. Not by being strong, but by being held. So new members, welcome to beloved community. Welcome to the grief circle. Welcome to the deep water. We've got you, and you've got us. Welcome to what it means to be a member of the Unitarian Church of the Truth. Amen.